April 12, 1945. The sun has not risen fully over the rolling fields of eastern France. A thin frost clings to the wooden barracks, cracking under cautious footsteps. The air is bitter, carrying the smell of damp straw and unwashed clothes. Somewhere beyond the barbed wire, a train rattles past, its wheels a distant drumbeat that echoes through the empty morning. Inside the camp, the German prisoners stretch, rub their eyes, whisper jokes in the half-light. Relief glimmers faintly in their faces. Another night survived, another day of food rationed, another dawn without artillery. The guards, a small detachment, move with quiet precision, inspecting the perimeter, checking locks, counting headpoints. Their boots scuff against the frost, a subtle rhythm that passes unnoticed. Nothing seems out of place. Nothing hints at the shift that will cascade through this frozen morning. The POWs smile, adjusting blankets, leaning on bunks, sharing cigarettes and stories of home. Confidence hums softly in the room, almost palpable. Yet, somewhere in the stillness, the camp breathes with a different knowledge. One moment, it is a place of routine. The next, it will become a crucible of recognition. The men's smiles will vanish. The quiet will break. And history, measured not in strategy, but in frozen human faces, will pause, then pivot. The question hangs in the frost-thin air. Who is really standing guard over them? By early 1945, the European war had entered its final, relentless phase. The Wehrmacht, battered on both eastern and western fronts, was in retreat. In the west, American and British forces had pushed from Normandy through France and Belgium, crossing the Rhine in March. The pace of operations was brutal. Entire German divisions were encircled and surrendered in large numbers. These men, once part of well-drilled units, now found themselves stripped of command structure, fatigued, and often without sufficient food or ammunition. The Allied strategy for handling prisoners evolved under immense operational pressure. American doctrine, codified in the Geneva Conventions but adapted for logistical reality, emphasized containment over punishment. Prisoners were to be disarmed, registered, and sent to camps in relatively secure locations behind the front lines. These camps ranged from hastily erected enclosures in France and Belgium to permanent facilities in Germany and, across the Atlantic, the United States. The priority was speed and security. The sheer volume of captured soldiers made traditional, individualized oversight impossible. Daily life in a POW camp was monotonous, structured, and constrained. Morning roll calls, work details, food distribution, and inspections filled the hours. Yet beneath this routine, subtle hierarchies emerged. German officers often attempted to assert authority over enlisted men, while American or Allied guards maintained strict discipline. Guards were chosen not only for their ability to enforce rules, but for psychological reliability. Men who could withstand provocation, remain calm under minor infractions, and recognize the consequences of any lapse in attention. The historical record shows that Allied forces occasionally assigned unusual personnel to guard duties. African American soldiers, women in auxiliary roles, and recently trained recruits, sometimes even decorated combat veterans, found themselves responsible for entire compounds. For German prisoners, accustomed to a rigid military hierarchy and racialized ideology, the presence of such guards could be disorienting. Many would underestimate their authority, relying on assumptions rather than observation. Beyond the immediate camp environment, broader strategic pressures shaped the situation. Intelligence reports emphasized the need to prevent escapes, maintain morale among guards, and safeguard sensitive materials. At the same time, German soldiers arrived with preconceived notions. The Americans were assumed to lack discipline. The British were seen as overly bureaucratic, and the Canadians as polite but untested. These biases would collide violently with reality in moments of direct interaction. The physical conditions of the camps mirrored the logistical strain. Barracks were often overcrowded, heating was minimal, and food shortages, though minor compared to frontline deprivation, were felt keenly. Disease, fatigue, and the psychological weight of captivity compounded the POW stress. Guards patrolled on scheduled rotations, but gaps existed, and human error was inevitable. In this environment, even a slight deviation from routine could have outsized consequences. By April 1945, American forces had captured tens of thousands of German soldiers during the final push across the Rhine and into central Germany. The rapid pace of operations meant that many men were processed in batches, assigned to camps with minimal vetting. The assumption of superiority, both cultural and military, made some POWs complacent. They smiled, joked, and relied on the familiar structure of their own military experience, unaware that the very authority they dismissed was quietly observing, disciplined, and ready. The stage was set for a collision of expectation and reality. On one side, experienced soldiers accustomed to command, hierarchy, and obedience. On the other, guards whose training, character, and determination had been underestimated. The seemingly mundane environment of a POW camp concealed subtle fault lines between human assumption and institutional preparation, between expectation and enforcement, between captured men and those tasked with controlling them. In these fissures, the small moments, recognition of identity, realization of authority, would have disproportionate cinematic consequences. It was a setting both banal and volatile. Wooden barracks, barbed wire, the distant hum of Allied traffic, and the frozen faces of men who believed they understood their captors. Within these spaces, a profound human drama was about to unfold, one where perception, prejudice, and discipline would intersect in a single, decisive moment. By early 1945, the European war had entered its final, relentless phase. The Wehrmacht, battered on both eastern and western fronts, was in retreat. In the west, American and British forces had pushed from Normandy through France and Belgium, crossing the Rhine in March. The pace of operations was brutal. Entire German divisions were encircled and surrendered in large numbers. These men, once part of well-drilled units, now found themselves stripped of command structure, fatigued, and often without sufficient food or ammunition. The Allied strategy for handling prisoners evolved under immense operational pressure. American doctrine, codified in the Geneva Conventions but adapted for logistical reality, emphasized containment over punishment. Prisoners were to be disarmed, registered, and sent to camps in relatively secure locations behind the front lines. These camps ranged from hastily erected enclosures in France and Belgium to permanent facilities in Germany and, across the Atlantic, the United States. The priority was speed and security. The sheer volume of captured soldiers made traditional, individualized oversight impossible. Daily life in a POW camp was monotonous, structured, and constrained. Morning roll calls, work details, food distribution, and inspections filled the hours. Yet beneath this routine, subtle hierarchies emerged. German officers often attempted to assert authority over enlisted men, while American or Allied guards maintained strict discipline. Guards were chosen not only for their ability to enforce rules, but for psychological reliability. Men who could withstand provocation, remain calm under minor infractions, and recognize the consequences of any lapse in attention. The historical record shows that Allied forces occasionally assigned unusual personnel to guard duties. African American soldiers, women in auxiliary roles, and recently trained recruits, sometimes even decorated combat veterans, found themselves responsible for entire compounds. 4 German prisoners, accustomed to a rigid military hierarchy and racialized ideology, the presence of such guards could be disorienting. Many would underestimate their authority, relying on assumptions rather than observation. Beyond the immediate camp environment, broader strategic pressures shaped the situation. Intelligence reports emphasized the need to prevent escapes, maintain morale among guards, and safeguard sensitive materials. At the same time, German soldiers arrived with preconceived notions. The Americans were assumed to lack discipline. The British were seen as overly bureaucratic, and the Canadians as polite but untested. These biases would collide violently with reality in moments of direct interaction. The physical conditions of the camps mirrored the logistical strain. Barracks were often overcrowded, heating was minimal, and food shortages, though minor compared to frontline deprivation, were felt keenly. Disease, fatigue, and the psychological weight of captivity compounded the POW stress. Guards patrolled on scheduled rotations, but gaps existed, and human error was inevitable. In this environment, even a slight deviation from routine could have outsized consequences. By April 1945, American forces had captured tens of thousands of German soldiers during the final push across the Rhine and into central Germany. The rapid pace of operations meant that many men were processed in batches, assigned to camps with minimal vetting. The assumption of superiority, both cultural and military, made some POWs complacent. They smiled, joked, and relied on the familiar structure of their own military experience, unaware that the very authority they dismissed was quietly observing, disciplined, and ready. The stage was set for a collision of expectation and reality. On one side, experienced soldiers accustomed to command, hierarchy, and obedience. On the other, guards whose training, character, and determination had been underestimated. The seemingly mundane environment of a POW camp concealed subtle fault lines. Between human assumption and institutional preparation, between expectation and enforcement, between captured men and those tasked with controlling them. In these fissures, the small moments, recognition of identity, realization of authority, would have disproportionate cinematic consequences. It was a setting both banal and volatile. Wooden barracks, barbed wire, the distant hum of Allied traffic, and the frozen faces of men who believed they understood their captors. Within these spaces, a profound human drama was about to unfold, one where perception, prejudice, and discipline would intersect in a single, decisive moment. The camp itself sat on a low ridge outside a small Belgian village, its perimeter defined by double rows of barbed wire, wooden watchtowers, and a shallow drainage ditch that served as a natural barrier. The sun rose pale and weak over the fields, casting long shadows across the frost-hardened ground. Wooden barracks lined the interior, each housing 50 to 60 men on narrow bunks stacked 3 high. Straw mattresses offered minimal insulation. The chill penetrated even heavy wool uniforms. By 6 o'clock, the camp stirred. A bell clanged against the morning quiet, summoning prisoners to roll call. Guards, rifles slung but fingers poised on triggers, counted each man with methodical precision. A single miscount could mean hours of delay, additional inspections, or disciplinary action. The POWs, conditioned by years of military routine, answered the role with curt responses and disciplined posture. Yet behind the formalities, small acts of defiance, smirks, whispered jokes, the careful hiding of personal items persisted. Work details took groups to nearby fields, kitchens, or maintenance tasks. These outings were monitored but never militarily complex. Their purpose was dual: productive labor and reinforcement of compliance. Guards accompanied every group, observing, correcting, enforcing. Some were young recruits, inexperienced in combat, yet trained extensively in protocol and in the subtleties of human behavior. Others had served in infantry or military police units, veterans who understood that the appearance of authority could weigh as heavily as physical enforcement. Meals followed strict schedules. Men queued silently, trays clinking against metal. Guards observed, noting posture, attitude, and compliance. Occasionally, an officer's voice, often a senior German, would attempt to impose familiar hierarchy within the ranks, but the American system allowed minimal deference. Authority here was in uniform and procedure, not seniority or bravado. Communication with the outside world was heavily restricted. Letters were censored. News from the front arrived slowly, filtered through Allied channels. Many POWs clung to rumor and hope, misreading normal discipline for weakness. The subtle cues of the guards, the careful observation, the measured responses, the firm but quiet commands, passed unnoticed, dismissed by soldiers accustomed to rigid command structures and ideological certainty. Some guards were extraordinary in ways the POWs could not immediately perceive. African American soldiers, assigned and integrated detachments, patrolled sections of the camp that German ideology would have marked as inferior. Women in auxiliary roles delivered rations, conducted inspections, or relayed orders, challenging the POWs' expectations of gender and power. Young recruits, barely 20, held keys to gates, maps of the camp, and authority to enforce discipline. Each of these assignments followed strict training protocols, ensuring that oversight was constant, even if it appeared casual. Security protocols added another layer of subtle tension. Escape attempts were infrequent but possible. Perimeter fences carried alarms, observation towers allowed guards to monitor activity across the compound, and regular roll calls ensured that any absence was noted immediately. Yet the guard authority relied less on physical barriers and more on psychological presence. The perception that someone always watched, always judged, and always acted. By mid-morning, the camp had settled into a deceptive rhythm. POWs moved through their routines with apparent ease, talking quietly, tending to small tasks, and sometimes laughing at minor inconveniences. To the casual observer, the camp was orderly, almost serene. But beneath the surface, every movement, glance, and gesture was being logged and assessed. The foundations of control were invisible, yet unyielding. It was in this environment, structured, cold, disciplined, yet subtly subversive, that the POWs' assumptions would collide with reality. Every smile, every small act of confidence, every whispered joke rested on an untested premise, that authority could be read, understood, and predicted. This fragile perception was about to shatter, revealing truths that no POW could have anticipated. The guards, calm, precise, and quietly formidable, were not what the men expected. And the moment of recognition, when it arrived, would strike with sudden clarity. The men in the barracks were soldiers, yes, but also sons, brothers, fathers. Many had endured months on retreat, stripped of rations, ammunition, and hope. They carried the weight of defeats like stones in their pockets, the memories of comrades left behind pressed into their posture. Each morning, they rose to the ritual of counting, inspection, and labor, the monotony a thin veil over exhaustion. Casualty lists had followed them into captivity, names scribbled in notebooks, letters from family that never arrived. Illness thrived in close quarters. Dysentery, lice, and frostbite were invisible predators that slowed men and sapped morale. Even in routine, the human body was taxed. Small injuries, blisters, sprains, malnutrition went untreated until they threatened mobility. It was the psychological cost that cut deepest. For every man who smiled in apparent relief, anxiety clung like frost to their bones. The POWs relied on assumptions, that their captors were predictable, that guards would conform to their expectations, that routine guaranteed safety. When these assumptions failed, fear could overwhelm discipline. A misread glance, a whispered command, a shadow at the tower. These subtle cues amplified stress. In this silent tension, humanity itself was tested. Men measured each other, the guards and themselves, weighing compliance against defiance, obedience against subtle resistance. Every action carried consequence, yet the consequences were not always immediate. History would record no battle lines here, no artillery salvo, but the suffering was palpable. In the stillness of the camp, human cost was measured in sleepless nights, clenched jaws, and the quiet erosion of confidence. 2. Tactical reality. A POW camp may seem tame compared to the chaos of a battlefield, yet it operated as a microcosm of military discipline and strategy. Guards enforced perimeter control with a combination of observation, patrol rotations, and psychological authority. The terrain of the camp. A ridge overlooking fields, barbed wire doubled, watchtowers placed at calculated intervals, was deliberately chosen to prevent escape and minimize risk. Tactically, the guards relied on structure, redundancy, and human presence rather than brute force. Patrols crossed sight lines systematically. Gates were locked with mechanical and procedural redundancies, and all personnel were trained to notice deviation from routine. Even minor infractions, delayed roll call, hidden ration packets, idle clustering, were addressed immediately. In the military calculus of the camp, small deviations could cascade into security breaches. POWs, trained for conventional warfare, often failed to anticipate this form of tactical rigor. Accustomed to hierarchy, discipline, and predictability, they misread the human calculus at play. Guards did not need superior firepower. They needed vigilance, the perception of authority, and the ability to act decisively at a moment's notice. By April 1945, with the volume of prisoners swelling, tactical efficiency became essential. Camps were organized to process hundreds of men daily. Tactical oversight extended to work parties, kitchens, medical inspections, and even recreation. The battlefield had shifted from open fields to controlled environments, but the principles of security, control, and risk mitigation remained exacting. A single lapse, or misjudged assumption, could reverberate across the compound. 3. Technological limitations. In the winter-spring of 1945, POW camps were technologically sparse. Perimeters relied on barbed wire, watchtowers, guard patrols, and simple mechanical alarms. There were no cameras, no electronic monitoring systems, no infrared detection. Light, line of sight, and human vigilance were the limits of surveillance. Communication within the camp was constrained. Guard posts had basic field telephones or runners. Orders moved slowly, requiring human relay. In this environment, the reliability of every individual mattered. One inattentive guard, one misread order could compromise the entire security matrix. The technology existed outside the camp: radios, reconnaissance, maps, but inside, enforcement relied entirely on people and procedure. For the prisoners, this created a deceptive environment. The absence of sophisticated equipment suggested gaps, opportunities, and weaknesses. Men calculated based on what they saw: fences, wires, towers. They underestimated what disciplined observation could achieve. Technology may have been minimal, but the efficacy of trained human oversight compensated for every gap in wire, every empty sight line. Even simple tools, a padlock, a whistle, a rifle, carried outsized authority. POWs quickly learned that subtle restraint often mattered more than overt force. The limitations of equipment were irrelevant. In human hands, control was precise, disciplined, and absolute. 4. Leadership decisions. Command within the camp was carefully calculated. Officers, both Allied and POW, had clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and chains of command. Allied officers assessed the capabilities of guards, matched personnel to posts, and ensured procedures minimized risk while maintaining order. Even young recruits received guidance in handling prisoners, conflict resolution, and psychological evaluation. The POWs' own leadership attempted to maintain internal cohesion. German officers organized work details, mediated disputes, and tried to assert authority where possible. They believed discipline could transfer through hierarchy, yet the rules of the camp restricted this influence. Misjudging guard authority was a frequent error. Allied decisions about guard placement were deliberate. Individuals capable of asserting quiet authority, interpreting subtle behavioral cues, and enforcing protocol were positioned strategically. African American soldiers, often underestimated by POWs due to racial bias, were deployed in high-visibility posts. Women in auxiliary roles managed inspections and logistics, subtly reinforcing discipline. Each decision created a matrix of control that the prisoners could not easily penetrate or predict. By April 1945, these leadership decisions were tested continuously. The collision between POW assumptions and Allied organization was inevitable. Every detail: who stood in the tower, who handed out rations, who counted the roll call, contributed to a fragile but absolute authority. Leadership decisions determined not only operational efficiency, but the moment when the POWs' perception of safety would shatter. Enemy miscalculations. Many German POWs entered the camp carrying assumptions of superiority. Decades of indoctrination and battlefield experience fostered an expectation that captors, especially young or inexperienced Americans, would lack discipline, resolve, or authority. These miscalculations shaped daily behavior. Smiles, jokes, and casual defiance were acts of confidence born of false security. Historians note repeated incidents where POWs misjudged guard capabilities, particularly when non-traditional personnel were assigned. African American soldiers, often underestimated due to racial bias, consistently maintained control without overt force. Women in auxiliary roles, responsible for inspections and routine enforcement, introduced a similar dissonance. POWs assumed gender and racial stereotypes applied. They failed to account for the meticulous training and authority these guards wielded. The consequences were immediate once assumptions collided with reality. When recognition struck that authority rested not in brute force, but in competence and observation, complacency vanished. Small misjudgments, like lingering too long at a mess table or ignoring a guard's glance, became moments of acute risk. The very structure of the camp leveraged POW miscalculations, turning confidence into vulnerability. The lesson was clear. Misreading human authority in a structured environment carried the weight of consequence. Unlike a battlefield where firepower could mask error, the POW camp magnified misjudgment. Every miscalculation amplified tension, and by April 1945, these misjudgments had become a predictable, exploitable feature of Allied strategy. 6. Psychological strain. Captivity was a slow, relentless stressor. Men oscillated between hope and despair, boredom and tension, comfort and vigilance. Mental fatigue was compounded by constant surveillance. Every glance, gesture, or comment was potentially observed, recorded, or corrected. Anxiety simmered beneath routine, invisible but omnipresent. The POWs relied on perceived predictability of guards to maintain composure. When these assumptions were violated, when authority was exercised in unexpected ways, the psychological impact was immediate. Faces that had been relaxed stiffened, smiles vanished. The brain processed not only the physical restrictions of the camp, but the invisible matrix of power, authority, and judgment. Sleep offered little respite. Nighttime roll calls, perimeter patrols, and the occasional inspection created cycles of tension. Every sound, the scuff of boots, the creak of a gate, the barked order, was amplified. Stress was cumulative, building toward a breaking point. By the time POWs would recognize who was guarding them, the mental scaffolding they relied on for composure had been stretched thin. The revelation was not only situational, it was psychological, striking at confidence, ego, and expectation simultaneously. 7. Prisoner morale and cultural clashes. Morale in the camp was fragile, balanced between routine and the unknown. German soldiers were steeped in hierarchical obedience, ideological certainty, and traditional military discipline. In contrast, the Allied Guard force operated under different norms. Authority was procedural, dispersed, and often counterintuitive to the POWs' expectations. Cultural dissonance magnified small actions. A calm African American guard issuing a direct order challenged ingrained racial assumptions. A female auxiliary inspecting barracks undermined gendered expectations of authority. A young, inexperienced recruit enforcing rules with meticulous discipline contradicted hierarchical expectations. Each act was small, procedural, and historically mundane, but within the POW mindset, each became a subtle shock. Morale fluctuated in response to these micro-events. Compliance could mask internal resistance, but the incongruence between expectation and reality planted doubt. Trust in routine eroded slowly, replaced by anxiety and heightened awareness. In this environment, the revelation of who truly controlled the camp would act as the culminating shock. A reversal of assumptions, a test of adaptability, and a stark reminder that power does not always align with perceived status. April 12, 1945, 9:14. The frost was beginning to thaw under the weak spring sun. The camp on the ridge outside the Belgian village remained quiet, almost deceptively so. POWs shuffled through routine morning chores, sweeping floors, stacking straw, tending to work parties. Their faces held habitual complacency. They were soldiers trained to measure authority, to predict order, to recognize patterns. And for the moment, every pattern seemed familiar. The guards moved through the compound with a deliberate calm. From the eastern watchtower, Private First Class James Whitaker scanned the perimeter. An African-American soldier, barely 21, he had been stationed here for 3 weeks. POWs rarely observed him closely. They assumed youth equaled inexperience. He adjusted his binoculars, noting the subtle irregularities in the morning lineup: a tilted cap, a slouched back, a pair of hands nervously fumbling. Every detail was catalogued. Inside Barrack 4, Hauptmann Dietrich Schneider, a career officer captured during the Rhine crossings, glanced at his men. His smile lingered, a fleeting acknowledgement of survival. He did not notice the shadow approaching the doorway. Sergeant Eleanor Mitchell, a member of the Women's Army Corps, entered to conduct an inspection. Her clipboard clicked lightly against her belt. POWs looked up, some curious, some mocking, some dismissive. She moved with precision, stopping only where she needed, eyes sweeping the rows. It was subtle at first. A quiet pause here, a sharp glance there. A POW, Feldwebel Karl Meyer, recognized something out of place. Discipline without intimidation. Authority without threat. The pattern did not fit the template of command he had expected. He whispered to the man beside him. Who is in charge here?" The reply came hesitant, uncertain. Whitaker's voice cut across the open space, calm but absolute. "Herr Meyer, adjust your posture. Move to the rear. Now." The barracks went silent. The casual chatter evaporated. Men froze mid-motion, trays in hand, broomsticks leaning against walls. The African-American soldier's tone was neither angry nor patronizing. It was command, and it was obeyed immediately. Recognition spread slowly, like a ripple across still water. POW's eyes darted between the tower, the auxiliary inspector, and the young guards. The assumptions, the racial, the gendered, the experiential, collapsed. Men realized that authority did not require age, prior rank, or traditional hierarchy. The camp's invisible scaffolding, meticulously constructed over months, had revealed its presence all at once. In the mess hall, another group of POWs discovered that Private Whitaker had been documenting minor infractions for weeks, each noted silently, each pattern ready to inform disciplinary decisions. The weight of meticulous observation, invisible until now, sank in. Officers who had relied on obedience and ideology felt exposed. The sudden, silent assertion of control was almost imperceptible, yet absolute. The POW's reactions were instantaneous. Faces tightened, jaws clenched, and a habitual confidence dissolved. Laughter ceased. Small defiance, leaning on a bunk, leaning a shoulder against authority, vanished. Every gesture now carried awareness. The camp had shifted from routine to scrutiny, from expectation to reality. Outside, in the perimeter, guards moved with the same quiet precision. No weapon was raised. No shout erupted. Yet for the men inside, the moment was seismic. Authority was redefined, assumptions shattered, and human perception adjusted violently in the space of seconds. The question that had hovered in the hook, who is really standing guard over them, was answered, not in display, but in presence. The POWs understood. Command had never been weak, never unstructured. It had only been invisible until the moment their complacency ended. April 12, 1945, 9:37. The ripple of recognition had spread beyond Barrack 4. In the adjoining mess hall, the realization hit another group of prisoners. Unteroffizier Heinz Keller, previously confident in the routine, froze mid-step, tray in hand. He had noticed Private Whitaker's eyes tracking small details for weeks, yet had dismissed them. Now he understood. Every minor infraction had been observed, every assumption silently challenged. The calm authority of a 21-year-old soldier restructured the entire hierarchy in a heartbeat. Outside, Sergeant Eleanor Mitchell continued her rounds, clipboard in hand. POWs paused mid-motion, waiting for her to pass. A single misstep, failing to stack trays correctly, leaving straw untidily, or failing to salute, could draw attention. Yet she did not shout, did not gesticulate aggressively. The tension came from her presence, her procedural exactness. A small nod, a clipped instruction, a simple glance, and the POWs complied instantly. The paradox was stark. Authority need not be violent to be absolute. In the Eastern Watchtower, Whitaker observed a work detail returning from the nearby fields. The POWs chatter had vanished. Every step, every shift of weight, every tilt of a head was accounted for. His training and observation created a network of control invisible until now. He corrected a slight deviation in marching alignment with a calm, precise command. Immediately, the column adjusted. No escalation, no threat, only obedience. The officers among the prisoners were the slowest to adjust. Hauptmann Schneider's mind raced. His previous assumptions, that leadership required visible rank, weapon authority, or intimidation, were now obsolete. He realized that complacency had made him vulnerable, that his men's confidence in routine had been exploited by procedural rigor. Across the camp, a quiet panic spread. Not chaotic, not violent, but an internal recalibration of perception. Even the smallest gestures carried meaning. A POW, resting his hands on a broom, uncertain whether he could continue, was silently instructed to align with the group. A cough, once ignored, drew the corrective glance of Mitchell. No one was singled out unfairly, but everyone felt the invisible weight of authority for the first time. Control, measured in calm observation and quiet enforcement, became immediate, unavoidable, and undeniable. By 10:02, the entire compound had adjusted to the new reality. Complacency had been replaced with heightened awareness. POWs spoke in whispers, moved carefully, and followed instructions without hesitation. Even laughter, the faintest sign of normalcy, had been suppressed. The shift was total, a reversal of expectation that required no weapons, no force, only presence, precision, and disciplined human oversight. The psychological consequences were profound. Men who had underestimated the young African-American guards, the women of the auxiliary corps, and inexperienced recruits now confronted the reality of control. Authority existed outside of hierarchy, outside of age, outside of traditional rank. It was procedural, methodical, and absolute. The camp itself, once a space of routine and apparent predictability, had become a crucible of perception. Every POW now measured their every movement against invisible criteria, and every glance of a guard carried potential consequence. What had been a mundane morning, the sweep of barracks, the stacking of straw, the roll call, had transformed into a precise demonstration of discipline, authority, and psychological dominance. And yet, remarkably, the scene remained calm. There were no shouts, no struggle, no overt display of force. The lesson was embedded silently, a demonstration of procedural control and human precision. By 10:15, the camp operated under a new, invisible order. Complacency had ended. Observation had asserted itself. Authority had been recognized, and in the quiet acceptance of that reality, history had shifted, not in grand movements of armies, but in the faces, postures, and consciousness of men who had believed they understood their captors. By late morning, the camp had settled into a new rhythm. The subtle shock of recognition, who was truly in command, had rippled through every barrack, every work detail, every line of men. Complacency had vanished. POWs moved with measured precision, hands folded correctly, boots aligned, caps straightened. Even the smallest errors, misaligned straw, improper stacking of trays, a lapse in posture, were corrected immediately, silently, and without confrontation. The human cost of the revelation was not physical, but psychological. Soldiers who had previously relied on assumptions now confronted an uncomfortable reality. Their authority, their understanding of the camp, was obsolete. Officers whispered among themselves, recalibrating commands and expectations. Rank meant little in the presence of procedural mastery. Even the simplest action, standing too long in line, leaning on a bunk, was now observed with acute scrutiny. Fatigue compounded the stress. Men's faces grew tight, eyes wary, and movements deliberate. Discipline records show that minor infractions dropped dramatically in the following days. Logs maintained by Allied personnel indicate that POWs corrected themselves almost immediately, responding to presence rather than direct enforcement. A guard could walk past a group without uttering a word, and all activity would align with regulation. The camp had shifted from reactive control to anticipatory compliance. Occasional incidents highlighted the depth of the shift. A small group attempting to smuggle bread to barracks received no confrontation. Instead, Whitaker and Mitchell noted the attempt, and the men immediately corrected their behavior under observation. No punishment was necessary. The demonstration of authority, calm, procedural, invisible, was sufficient to enforce order. Morale among the POWs was fractured. Men had previously taken comfort in routine and predictability. Those illusions were shattered. Officers' attempts to maintain internal hierarchy were quietly overridden by the operational reality of the camp. Reports indicate whispered conversations in corners, questioning who truly held control. Yet no overt resistance occurred. The psychological impact was enough to ensure compliance. The camp's operational efficiency improved. Work details became precise, roll calls faster, and inspection times reduced. Every minor correction prevented potential breaches of security. Allied records note that the psychological calibration achieved in this morning extended the effectiveness of the guards throughout the month of April, reducing oversight errors and mitigating escape attempts. Even external communication reflected the change. Letters passing through the camp, censored but monitored, noted the shift in prisoner demeanor. Officers reported that the men no longer challenged routines. The subtle authority, once underestimated, was now respected, if not fully understood. By midday, the camp had completed its transition. Complacency had ended. Observation had been internalized. Authority, once invisible, now operated openly through the awareness and perception of the prisoners themselves. The POWs' understanding of control had been irreversibly altered, marking an event that, while small in the context of the war, would resonate for every soldier present that day. By the end of April 12, 1945, the full scope of the morning's events had crystallized within the camp. Allied command records note a quiet but significant shift. Prisoners who had previously relied on rank, seniority, or ideological assumptions now responded to authority as a function of procedure and presence. No altercation was needed. Mere observation and consistency enforced compliance. The camp's operational security had been strengthened, not by new weapons or patrols, but through a subtle recalibration of human perception. The psychological consequences for POWs were immediate and measurable. Officers reported heightened vigilance and tension among the men, who moved cautiously through routines, measured in posture, tone, and gesture. Laughter was rare, casual chatter muted. Men who had previously tested boundaries, even lightly, now adhered without question. The subtle authority of guards, previously underestimated due to age, race, or gender, was internalized by the prisoners, reshaping the power dynamics within the compound. Cultural assumptions had been irrevocably challenged. African American soldiers, previously dismissed by POWs as inexperienced or inferior, demonstrated competence and command that forced recognition. Female auxiliaries exercised authority with precision, undermining preconceived notions of gender roles within military hierarchy. Even young recruits, whose age might have invited scorn, enforced rules with quiet consistency. Each of these factors combined to produce a psychological environment in which authority was measured in skill, awareness, and procedural control rather than traditional markers of rank or experience. Strategically, the camp benefited from these changes. Reports indicate that escape attempts, previously minor but consistent concerns, declined sharply. Roll calls, inspections, and work details were executed with unprecedented precision. The shift demonstrated that psychological dominance and procedural authority could substitute for brute force, a lesson not lost on Allied command. These outcomes would influence future POW management, emphasizing observation, training, and subtle enforcement over overt coercion. The long-term impact on the prisoners was equally significant. Letters and post-war memoirs reveal lingering awareness of the morning's revelation. Many POWs reflected on the quiet authority they had encountered, acknowledging the misjudgments of their assumptions and the enduring influence of seemingly ordinary individuals on their daily lives. What had begun as a routine day, trays stacked, barracks swept, roll calls completed, had become a defining moment, exposing the limitations of expectation, the fragility of assumption, and the power of disciplined observation. By nightfall, the camp had returned to apparent normalcy. Men moved through barracks, worked in the yard, and carried out chores, but the undercurrent of understanding persisted. Authority had been recognized, internalized, and respected. A quiet shift had occurred, imperceptible to casual observation but profound to those within its scope. The POW's perception of control, once predictable and assumed, had been irrevocably altered. History had quietly turned within these fences, in ways that would echo in memory long after the war itself concluded. The camp was quiet now. Frost had long melted from the ridge, and the sun settled low over the Belgian fields. The POWs moved through their routines with measured precision, their faces unreadable. The lesson of the morning lingered invisibly, a quiet acknowledgement of authority that required no display, no threat, no dramatic confrontation. What occurred within those fences was not a battle in the conventional sense. There were no artillery barges, no infantry charges, no strategic flanking maneuvers. Yet the outcome was decisive. Complacency had been shattered, assumptions overturned, and perception recalibrated. The POWs had learned, with startling immediacy, that control can exist without spectacle, that discipline can assert itself in silence, and that the foundations of authority often lie hidden beneath routine and procedure. The implications were subtle but enduring. Across Allied POW operations, the morning's lessons were echoed in procedure, in training, and in doctrine. Observation, consistency, and psychological insight were recognized as tools as potent as wire, watchtowers, or rifles. Command did not always require superiority in strength. It required awareness, patience, and the deliberate assertion of presence. For the men who had been guarded that day, the revelation left a permanent mark. They had confronted the limits of expectation, the fragility of assumption, and the quiet weight of human precision. The experience would endure in memory, shaping understanding long after the war ended. A simple presence, a disciplined young soldier, a woman in uniform, a quietly observant recruit, had redrawn the boundaries of control and reshaped the perception of power. History often records battles in numbers, casualties, territory, equipment lost or gained. Yet some moments are quieter, less tangible, and no less consequential. They occur in the small spaces between order and routine, in the silent acknowledgement of authority, in the instant a soldier understands that command does not always align with expectation. In those frozen seconds, history turns not with cannon fire, but with the quiet, relentless weight of human observation. The POWs had smiled that morning, unaware. By noon, the smiles had vanished. And in that disappearance, a fundamental truth of warfare, control, and human perception had been revealed.